Frank the Nation is a podcast for thoughtful, informed adults, preferably with a pour in hand. The views and opinions expressed on the show are those of the hosts and guests only, and do not reflect the views of any employers, institutions, licensing boards, government agencies, bourbon distilleries, or family members, especially our family members. They've asked us to be very clear about that. This show is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing said here should be taken as medical, psychiatric, legal, or professional advice. If you're in crisis, call a professional. If you're mad at something we said, we suggest journaling or emailing us with civility. We're here to challenge ideas, not diagnose strangers. We're clinicians, not your clinicians, and we have the bourbon to prove it. Let's go. No jokes, no bourbon, just seriousness. Political violence is not a partisan personality test. It's a human behavior that becomes more likely when the system runs hot. High arousal, humiliation, sleep loss, visible weapons, a rumor moving faster than verification, and a permission cue that says, people like us do this. When those ingredients stack, brakes fail. For clarity, by political violence, I mean threats, coordinated harassment, doxing, assaults, plots, and targeted property destruction tied to political identity, officials, or institutions. Protest is protected speech. Intimidation and harm are not. Psychology is broadly symmetric across tribes. Recent patterns in targets and lethality are not. Both facts can be true at once. Ground rules for this conversation: we will name tactics and incentives, not tribes. We will not use dehumanizing language. We will separate grievance from permission. We will privilege evidence over anecdotes. The scoreboard that matters is simple: fewer credible threats, fewer doxings, fewer offline plots, slower rumor to incident timelines, and safer events measured by injuries and arrests per attendee. Welcome to a sobering episode of Strength the Nation. To get started, I'm David. I'm a board-certified psychiatrist with 20 plus years in the military. We're not doing bourbon tonight. We're just having a serious conversation.
I'm Rob. Yeah, and I concur. It is a serious topic. I also am a psychiatrist, 25 years, about 30 years in the military. And tonight we're talking about political violence. I think probably for obvious reasons, not to name specific incidents, but there certainly has a sense that the frequency is on the rise, which made me interested in, have we seen this before? Now, way back, I mentioned a book by a guy named George Friedman called The Storm Before the Calm. And Dr. Friedman basically traces the history of the United States and has divided us up into 50-year cultural and 80-year economic cycles. And the 2020s is the first time in the history of the United States that those cycles actually fall in the same decade. If we go backwards, the last time that there was a higher level of political violence would have been the late 60s, early 70s. And there was some high-profile assassinations, a general high heat level in the public will. That falls in one of our social cycles. So if you trace the time frame, that cycle, that 50-ish year social cycle. And of course, what they were focused on at that moment in time were Vietnam, civil rights. There were numerous radical movements, and the violence certainly peaked. That was on cultural and identity issues. I go back to the 30s, which would have been the last economic cycle. It ended because of World War II, but there was extreme public protest and riots. That was related to economics. The difference now is that there are combined factors. We have an economic underlay that is creating tension and culture wars. At this point, it's starting to look like war is not an exaggeration. I thought it would be useful to talk about violence and trace back some issues that might be driving violence at this particular juncture.
Friedman's cycles that he spoke about, they're explanatory frames or models. They're not specific clocks, essentially. Violence, it's contingent. It's not inevitable, but here we are. Those conditions that we're seeing that might drive the violence aren't required. We can change. That's hopefully the point of the conversation, is to highlight some of the things that might be driving it and then figure out what can we all do on individual and the national levels to cool this down.
When I look at these past incidents and then I compare it to now, the thing that's in common is that there is an underlining driver which creates a tension. And that tension seems to lead toward tribalization. Tribalization in general seems to be one of the driving forces for acts of violence. The more we start to divide the world into us and them, then the more likely violence is to happen. World War II ended a period of general uprising and public dissatisfaction, riots. It was very much economically driven. It's not surprising it ended in World War II for two factors. One, the onset of the war unified us. We became us. Across the board, us and them became Germans and the Japanese. But then the second thing is it solved the economic crisis. The end of the Depression came because of World War II and the opportunities related to that.
You're talking social identity theory.
Mhm.
When group identity is threatened and the readiness to defend the in-group rises for all of us. The fascinating thing you point out is that the in-group can be quite large. It really just depends on who the targeted out-group is. So World War II, obviously, we, as a nation, we were able to identify as the in-group. Not to step all over our shadow episode, but there were definitely groups within the United States who were not in the in-group during that period of time. And they got a brunt of the negative dehumanization that occurs within that particular thought process. Do you think there was a similar situation that maybe was starting to brew in the early 2000s that changed because of Operation Iraqi Freedom and the ability for us to shift that in-group to expand it?
I can go backwards in time and certainly trace at least our current brand of tribalism to the mid-90s. Suppose one could imagine escalation of that may have occurred, and we were attacked. 9/11 happens, the World Trade Center. That did have something of a unifying force. The difference was, I think, our sense of safety, being untouchable, was impacted. I don't necessarily think anyone felt it was an existential threat, quite like World War II.
Yeah.
Having lived through that period, I don't recall significant political violence that it feels is occurring at this time. The reason I brought up the history is that I feel that it's high. It's a tricky thing about feelings. However, you're feeling at this moment, you, one, feel like it's very real and very significant, and then two, kind of predict that it's just going to get worse. So anyone who's listening, our tens of listeners, they know what it feels like to have a crisis in their life and how it colors their perception of the future and can sometimes becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You end up acting out of those emotions and making the worst come true.
In the past, the thing that seemed to break those cycles was World War II. There were economic factors attached to that, changing the in-group. Now we have a whole different circumstance. What's making this hotter for all of us? I hate to blame social media again, but I'll include social media as being a factor. Fear and anger, we've already known that travels the fastest within media environments, but we have supercharged that movement with social media. And we've already seen that outrage and anger are more likely to be shared than anything else. It's much more likely to go viral. So how much is that playing into what we're currently seeing?
A significant amount. It feels to me that this is not just specific to violence, but in general, we found more and more ways to connect, but also to disconnect from the people around us, real live humans. It's infinitely easier to hate the person on the other end of a Facebook post or a TikTok video than it is to hate a person that you shared a meal with, done community service with, or helped at your kid's school. That allows for an emotional connection that can transcend differences in politics. Whereas online, it is a faceless other that is not you and not your group. And it does seem to escalate, and it certainly seems to speed up the process. The other concern I have for just modern media in general is that acts of violence can be a contagion that stimulates copycat acts of violence. And some of the attention, and in fact, some news outlets are becoming savvy to this, and they're very cautious about how they present these things. Problem is they can be as cautious as they want to be, but social media takes it and runs out into the fringe theories, the us versus them. And even the fact that after an act of violence now, the first predictable outcome is the argument that that's your group or not. Either the group tries to disavow, nope, no connection, not us, it wasn't us, or no, it was your group. And it's a red herring. It's a thought problem drawing that conclusion, because the reality is these individuals are unique and it's not about their group identity. It has something else. The group identity gave them an excuse, but boy, there were a lot of other things going on with these individuals to make them act in the violent way in which they did.
We're seeing more of it. To call into social media, I want to define it a bit more broadly than our typical platforms that people think about: Facebook, TikTok, Instagram. When you think about how the internet has connected people so quickly and provided broader chat rooms where like-minded people who have these very specific niches, the way that the internet has connected people together so quickly, it really expands your social circle globally. Before, you might come across somebody who also enjoys that thing, but now it's very easy to find the other 11 people on the planet who have that same thought process that you do. The bigger issue here is the ability to supercharge those very specific feelings in that small group in what feels like an intimate setting, but isn't, and is very open to outside influence. You're not just going down the rabbit hole by yourself anymore. You're going down it and getting dragged down it with other people, which is its own accelerant. We've seen how conspiracy theories really get out of hand. This isn't going to be any different. The end result is not just political violence, but violence in and of itself. Folks who have this very one mindset kind of encourage one another. They're writing each other's names on bullet casings and things like that. And I agree with you that legacy media is starting to pick up on the fact that not naming names when they're reporting would potentially help to calm this down. The problem is these online communities aren't controlled by legacy media or really anybody. And so when that information becomes available, it still catches fire. And everybody's carrying around cell phones now when political violence is occurring. It's being documented, videoed, put online, and shared. If you're already looking at ways to have impact, this is just supercharging it. And there really isn't a lot of control to stop it, especially with certain platforms that want nothing to do with limiting what people can or cannot share. And that's a problem.
A significant one. I think the other underlying issue here is that people tend to be more prone to violence when they feel that their identity or their worldview is challenged. The economic issues has certainly driven violence. There's a slight difference in that usually that was in the context of organized groups. So groups of unemployed that had come together under a banner might riot out of frustration. This does seem to be leading more to targeted violence against certain individuals who are expressing a worldview or a set of principles that challenge people's identity, which is leading down the path of violence.
The challenge here with the way that we're so connected, if you're looking for people who are vulnerable to radicalization going down the rabbit hole, your net is so wide, it's a lot easier to catch those people. And they're finding themselves. They're going in and walking down the path. I wonder how much the algorithms that we talked about play into helping people go down that path.
Absolutely. I have no doubt. I know the power of clicking one thing and then for the next 3 or 4 or 5 weeks until you hit some magic number of clicking something else, it sends you down these paths. And each time you click something similar, you're further down the path and you get a little more closer to the fringe, and on it goes. And it belies something, though, that tribalism is a psychological defense, that when you feel alone and you're uncertain and you're anxious, being a part of a group, feeling like you've got a group of people around you, us versus them, does feel better. That is probably as old as humans are. The tribe was always very important to us, and being separated from the tribe was a death sentence through much of human history. And other tribes were a threat to the survival of your tribe. So we have a natural inclination to tribe up. The problem is that we live in a multicultural, multi-ethnic melting pot, to wit, we have always been somewhat proud of. The tribe is the United States. And unfortunately, the tribe has changed and becoming something else. And right now it is falling under worldview and cultural fault lines.
Do you see that there's an issue with the rhetoric that's coming from top down and bottom up?
Mm-hmm.
It's all over the place. This push to define groups in tribal terms. It's a normal human trait to do that, but the us versus them, it's not easing up. It's getting worse with time, and outrage being the commodity that's traded, especially online, really heating up the situation.
Well, top down, bottom up, and how those become a positive feedback loop. From the bottom, if what is getting their attention is tribalism, then the top is going to identify that and play into that projection that's coming from the tribe, the anxieties that exist, that sense of threat, because gosh, there's nothing that drives people to the polls more significantly than just fear. Fear is a very powerful motivator. When you look at elections, fear is often the more powerful thing that will drive someone, even self-interest. It's just fear. And we certainly are seeing a lot of single issue voters that are falling into this identity politics, and it is social media driven, legacy media driven. Everyone who is listening to this can identify the left leaning legacy TV network and the right leaning. I shouldn't even say leaning. They are very clearly on the left and very clearly on the right. So that ends up driving it and just becomes a positive feedback loop, and it escalates and the heat goes up. The thermostat is higher and higher and higher. And in that environment, if we don't have leaders and mechanisms to turn that thermostat back down, it's the nature of a positive feedback loop. They spin out of control until they burn out.
Some of the psychological factors that play into this, the projection, placing uncomfortable feelings onto others, splitting, finding black and white, no gray area, and cognitive dissonance, really struggling to deal with the conflict within. All of these things are playing a role, as are echo chambers that we self-create through the use of social media, the internet, our own confirmation bias, looking for things that just feel good to us or just feel to us. That's a key point to make, is that when outrage can also feel good, but it really drives the attention. And so all of these things that we've spoken about before, coupled with some of the socioeconomic factors, the political factors, where our political leaders can identify what's getting attention and play into that. All of this makes for a much hotter environment for political violence, correct?
Without a doubt. So there's the echo chamber effect, which it's confirmation bias. You believe something and then you go down the rabbit hole, and then everything you see supports what you believe and you feel good about it. It prevents you from having any experience of dissonance. And one of the human tendencies to resolve dissonance is by lashing out. When someone goes down these rabbit holes and begin to feel so righteous in their belief structure because they're never exposed to an alternative perspective, then when they are exposed to an alternative perspective, particularly if that perspective is a good one, their gut instinct is that that's not a bad argument, you're going to get a higher level of cognitive dissonance, a higher anxiety level, and there's going to be a demand that you need to resolve that. And resolution can come in lots of ways. One way could be, I suppose, rethinking your position. That's unlikely. What's more likely is you're going to lash out.
I want to differentiate a couple of things. One, as far as violence goes, mass violence, there's a factor of almost one-upsmanship that you're starting to see. That's not necessarily what we're seeing with political violence. With these mass violence incidents, you're seeing people that are looking for notoriety, clicks. Some of that does play into political violence. What you're talking about, though, is the internal conflict, the dissonance that with these more individualized incidents where somebody is going down a rabbit hole in an echo chamber, feeling a very specific way, feeling righteous in what they're doing. They're not necessarily going out to just create chaos. At times, they're feeling quite justified in what they're doing. Everybody is a protagonist in their own life. Most people don't believe that they're the bad guy in these situations. That underscores the trouble with the echo chamber. You can become convinced that the right thing to do is something that's so terrible. It's difficult for any of us to sit back and fully understand what any individual person was doing or thinking at these times. All we can really do is identify some of the factors that might make it more likely for somebody to travel down that path.
Mm-hmm.
There is that kind of subtle difference between somebody who's just creating mass chaos to get my name on the list
Mm-hmm.
versus somebody who's saying, I'm trying to resolve something. Neither is right. Neither is okay. Both are brought down that path in similar ways. The end result being slightly different, but
Sure.
equally horrifying.
Sure. And it would be interesting to see some profiles comparing mass shooters to folks who engage in political violence. I do have this sense that there is a distinction, there's a difference between engaging in a mass shooting of a random population versus the nature of political violence, which is very targeted and specific. Although many of these folks who have engaged in that, as it turns out, they were actually casing numerous politicians and sometimes on both sides of the aisle. Interestingly, I don't necessarily know how helpful it is to identify a single individual and say this is what was going on with that individual, because I think what we're talking about is a general climate, a temperature, numerous factors that are leading to this. They need to belong to an in-group to feel comfort, to feel safe. So underlying all that is that there's a general sense of uncertainty and fear, and that's driving us to tribalism, which drives us to project, which drives us to split, which drives us to experience dissonance, and then drives us to have this incredible need to resolve that dissonance. One way to do it is just shut the person who is talking up. Not only is it a horrendous act, it's a shot to the heart of democracy. We have a First Amendment for a reason, and the Supreme Court has said even hate speech is protected speech. And it's one of those, I guess, slippery slopes where you can argue the details, but ultimately I think we're better with freedom of speech than without.
We've identified some of the factors, and we'd be kidding ourselves if we could say this is everything. It's not. There are certainly plenty of things that go into what drives anybody towards political violence. And even the definition of political violence being very broad. We're not going to go into specifics, but really any violent act for political reasons is political violence. This can occur in groups. It can occur individually. It occurs across the spectrum. This is not one side that does it. This is not one group that is more likely to do it. All of us are not immune to going down that path. So this is the challenge. This is the hardest part, I think, about this topic is what the hell can we do about it? What are our prescriptions here?
Yeah, lots of thinking on this. There's a theme to so many of our prescriptions, which is ultimately act locally, get involved. Human engagement with another person that you're looking at them in the eye is radically different than online engagement. And it does end up exposing you to different viewpoints with someone that you might respect, someone that you might like. And it's going to make that dissonance easier to tolerate. The other thing I'm going to suggest, ultimately, it's the maintenance of freedom of speech. And it is not allowing yourself to have these one-sided views. Sitting and watching these things for hour after hour because they make you feel better to hear people that agree with you is not actually giving you a fuller picture and not helping you be more tolerant of the dissonance. There is a certain amount of that we have to be able to sit with in a democracy. And it certainly helps when there's not other economic factors and AI and whatever else is driving the baseline anxiety.
I want to take what you said. I want to expand on it a little bit. My prescription is for people to get real with themselves. I hear it often where somebody would say, I don't trust any source. And then they present facts, quote unquote, that are coming from a source. Or I'll hear somebody say, I listen to both arguments all the time, but then they only stick to one side. Our brains don't like nuance. We don't like to have to think through difficult, challenging concepts. And so when I say get real, I mean that. Pull yourself out of your echo chamber. Ask yourself, am I polarized myself? Ask yourself that question. Do I find myself too far to the right, too far to the left? Am I looking at the other side as being the enemy rather than being somebody that I simply disagree with. That's the echo chamber. And it's not just legacy media, it's your online life, which isn't a life. When you're getting your news, your information from a curated source like social media, you're getting dragged down a pipeline that is meant to just get your eyes on it, which means you're not getting a full perspective. Understand that you're not immune to this. None of us are. What are you willing to do to pull yourself out to not go down this path? Just as Rob said, talk to people, actual people in person, sit with the discomfort of disagreement, but understanding that our in-group is our country. Our goal is to allow democracy to continue. It can't if both sides are so polarized that there's fighting against each other and that anybody who disagrees even a little bit is in the out.
Well, and it's not a zero-sum game. And right now it feels like it's a zero-sum game. They win or we win, they lose or we lose. And the reality is that the success of our neighbors is everyone's success. It plays into the overall economy. It plays into our ability to stay ahead of the world, and it always has. I mean, one of the reasons we've always been successful is because we are a melting pot. We've had lots of brilliant people come to this nation and do amazing things, and then we take ownership of them as an American thing. Google it. See how many American inventions were actually by someone who otherwise we would have considered part of our outgroup. It's critical for our democracy. It's critical for our future success.
I would argue right now we're all losing.
Yeah, absolutely.
When the environment gets this hot, when people get this mad at somebody simply for a label that you have placed on them, when you're so mad at a label that you've created, we all lose. It's going to sound silly. Back off of the internet. Spend more time with other human beings. Get back to a place where you can just talk and get along and respectfully disagree, but understand that we're all moving in the same direction. That would help.
Yeah.
We need better leadership across the board. We need leaders who are willing to say exactly what we're saying, to calm things down and to realize that what gets you clicks is not what's going to help us as a country, to share the fact that we all need to tone down rhetoric completely.
Yeah, I'm in full agreement.
And that's it. Thanks for sticking around. Just a short episode today to talk about a really important topic. And we're all crossing our fingers that the message to make some change gets across, and that people are willing to hold themselves to a bit of a higher standard and are willing to make the difficult changes that are going to have to be made to improve the situation for everybody. When we win, we all win.
Absolutely. Well said.
All right. Well, we'll cue up that music and see you next time.